I, just as an aside, signed a 3-book contract with my publisher. And there are 2 more Cork books in that contract, and a book that's not a Cork O'Connor novel. But I'm at work on the next Cork O'Connor novel, and I'm having such a good time. I'm so excited about it. But I won't say anything about that particular book at this point in time. You know, that's basically what I have to say to you this evening. And I was asked if I could leave some time for question and answer. That's where we are. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them now. In the middle.
What writers influenced your own writing, and who would you recommend to us?
You know, there are 2 parts to that question. One involves writers in the genre and writers outside the genre. Inside the genre, Tony Hillerman was a great influence. Yes. You don't know the work of Tony Hillerman? He's was an icon. He passed away last year. Wrote a series that was set in the Four Corners area of the United States. It deals significantly with the Navajo culture. And because he did so well what he did, it was an inspiration for me to use the Ojibwe and incorporate their culture in my own work. So Tony Hillerman, I love the dark end of the genre. I read dark writers, I'll tell you that right now. James Lee Burke is one of my favorites. Dennis Lehane. I'll throw these names out. You could ask Carol about them later. Michael Connolly never disappoints me. C.J. Box, who does very much what I do in Wyoming. Steve Hamilton, Craig Johnson. All of those people are really, I'm reading them these days. Outside the genre, you know, I was a Hemingway fan very early on. And although some of his work doesn't still hold up for me, a lot of it does. The Old Man and the Sea is a book I go back and reread almost every year. And the short stories, Steinbeck, and of course, F. Scott Fitzgerald. But you know, these days, if I'm not reading mysteries, mysteries are what are really my reading genre of choice these days. But when I'm not reading them, I read Midwestern authors because I love the Midwest sensibility. I love the Midwest voice, which for me is something that it usually is very spare but very elegant, and it rises out of a profound sense of place. So I read Marilyn Robinson and Kent Harroff, and there's a new guy in town called Kent Myers. If you haven't read his work, you should familiarize yourself. John Hassler, a wonderful Minnesota writer. So those are some of the people that I read. Yeah?
Where'd you get the name Cork O'Connor?
Cork O'Connor. You know, long before I knew I was going to write Iron Lake, I had conceived of a protagonist. And all I knew about him was he was the kind of guy who was so resilient that no matter how far life pushed him down, he would always bob back to the surface. And his name was going to be Cork. Swear to God. Then when I decided to set my books up north in Minnesota and made the decision to incorporate the Ojibwe, and then made the decision to have a protagonist who had a foot in 2 different cultures, white and Ojibwe, I thought about, okay, I could have made him Ojibwe Finnish, or Ojibwe Italian, or Ojibwe Slav, or Ojibwe German, all of which exist. But for a variety of reasons, made Cork Irish. And Cork became Corcoran very naturally, Corcoran O'Connor. He was pretty much born. Yeah. That very lovely lady at the back of the room.
Could you say anything about Ordinary Grace?
She asked me about a book called Ordinary Grace. I'll tell you a little bit about Ordinary Grace. I told you I signed a 3-book contract with my publisher. 2 Cork O'Connor novels and one that isn't a Cork O'Connor novel. And it's a book called Ordinary Grace. One of the reasons I wanted to step back from the Cork O'Connor series was 3 years ago a story came knocking at my door that wouldn't go away. I had no business writing it because long ago my publisher made it very clear to me they only want Cork O'Connor novels from me. And I was in the middle of trying to meet my contractual obligations to them. So to clear my desk and start working on something else was a pretty stupid thing to do. And certainly risky. But in the end I didn't have a choice. This story was so compelling that I finally had to spend time writing it. So I did. I cleared my desk and I sat down. And over the course of the next 3 years, whenever I had time, I worked on this story. And it became a manuscript called Ordinary Grace. It's very different from all my Cork O'Connor books. Here's the story. It's very simple. It takes place in the summer of 1961. in a small town in southern Minnesota. It's the story of a Methodist minister whose beloved child is murdered. But it's really the story of what that tragedy does to his faith, his family, and ultimately the whole fabric of this small town in which he lives. If you're familiar with my work, you may be aware that in many of the stories there's a kind of an odd undercurrent running through the books. And it's the undercurrent of the spiritual journey. And it rises very naturally out of who Cork O'Connor is. He's a man with a foot in two different spiritual traditions, and so he's always trying to figure out where his own particular spiritual path lies. And that's been an issue for me all my life. And what Ordinary Grace allowed me to do was explore more deeply that very personal issue. I thought Ordinary Grace was the best thing I'd ever written, but that was my opinion. I sent it to my editor, who had told me long ago she wanted nothing from me except Cork O'Connor novels. 2 weeks after I sent it to her, I got a telephone call from her, and she said, "Kent, I have to tell you, I have been reading your manuscript as I come into work on the subway, and as I go home," this is New York City, "as I go home on the subway, and I've had to stop doing that because people wonder why I'm crying on the subway." She bought it. It's scheduled for publication in the fall of 2013. But it's finished, and I continue to think it's the best thing I've ever written. Maybe the best thing I will ever write. Thank you for asking. That's Ordinary Grace.